Thank yous for coming along. This is part of the penultimate event in our Borders and Boundaries, which has looked at the meanings and realities of borders and boundaries in Northern Ireland and around Northern Ireland for the last century, which has been gratefully funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs Reconciliation Fund. And I'll now hand you over to our chair, Maria McManus.
Hello. I'm going to, first of all, introduce you to our panellists. On my far right, dodgy and all as that sounds, is Tony Macauley. Tony is an author, peace builder and broadcaster, and his memoirs of growing up in Belfast are Paperboy, Bread Boy and All Growed Up, and they have all been adapted into musicals. His autobiography, Little House on the Peace Line, tells the story of how he lived and worked on the Peace Line in the 1980s. His debut novel, Belfast Gate, was Book of the Week in the Irish News. His latest novel, Kill the Devil, a love story from Rwanda, was co-authored with Rwandan screenwriter Juvens Sabimana. Thank you. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by Ulster University for services to literature and peace building at home and abroad. So that'll be Dr. Tony Macauley to you. And next to Tony, then we have Michelle Gallen. Michelle was born in Northern Ireland in the mid-1970s and grew up during the Troubles, a few miles from the border between what she was told was the Free State and the United Kingdom. She studied English literature at Trinity College Dublin, and her debut novel, Big Girl, Small Town, was shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award. Her critically acclaimed second novel, Factory Girls, won the Comedy Women in Print Award and was shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature Encore Award. Both books are being adapted for television. And finally, to my immediate right is James Conor Patterson. He is from Newry in County Down, and his debut poetry collection, Bandit Country, received an Eric Gregory Award in 2019 and was nominated for the T.S. Eliot Prize, the John Pollard International Poetry Prize, and the Michael Murphy Memorial Prize. So that's our esteemed panel for this evening, and thank you. So we're going to talk this evening about borders in our immediate context primarily, but may I ask first of all, because there will be time at the end for the audience to ask questions, and we want to reassure you that we will leave time for that at the end and to have you engaged in the discussion. But one of the things that Tony and I had a yarn about before we came out this evening was to ask how many of you in the audience were born elsewhere or lived elsewhere as a child in particular. So we have a few people who were out with the Northern Ireland context. And other than that, mostly people who were born and reared here, as it were. Yes. And finally, on that theme, how many people in our audience have lived elsewhere? So a good number of people have actually the experience of living elsewhere. Thank you for that. So when I was also doing my prep for today, I was having thoughts about actually Carl Sagan's comments about the pale blue dot and this planet that we all share, and that notion in a way of zooming from a very, very big picture into the specific locale of here. And I was also struck in that preparation by the memory and the story of the astronaut Michael Collins, who was the one when the moon landings were happening. He was the one who stayed on the Apollo and went to the dark side of the moon. And he took that very famous photograph, Earthrise, and in so doing captured a shot that kind of really took in everything, literally everything living and dying under the sun, with the exception of his own self. And from that distance, no borders. So I plant that with you in the first instance. And Tony, I want to come to you, actually, first of all, and ask you to give us some context of your experience of Rwanda in particular, because I thought this was a really interesting thing from your own history and your own experience. So will you speak to us of that, please?
Yes, so as a result of being involved in peace building here to start with, but I have been involved in other post-conflict countries in different parts of the world. And actually most recently, it's probably only the past 5 or 6 years, been involved with a reconciliation initiative in Rwanda. And I've been there a number of times now, and I think what's interesting about Rwanda is the world kind of remembers 1994, which was the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, as this, one of the most horrific incidents in our lifetime, where 1 million people were killed in 100 days. And going to Rwanda, you see the memorials, you hear all about that, and you learn about genocide, and you learn about genocidal ideology and how it's used to sort of prepare the way for genocide. So there's a lot to learn about that in Rwanda. But what had the biggest impact on me was what has happened there since, which is an incredible journey of reconciliation, which I haven't seen anywhere else in the world, and certainly hasn't happened in our context here. A level of reconciliation between perpetrator and survivor in ordinary people in local communities, in the villages and the hills of Rwanda, which I haven't seen the like of. So I would call it extreme forgiveness, what I've experienced there. So on some of my visits, I've spent time in storytelling workshops and workshops where a perpetrator and a survivor will stand up and tell their story, and a woman will stand up and say, "This man killed my husband and killed my children." And this man will say, "I was responsible for the murder of this woman's family." And then they tell the story of how he sought forgiveness, and she tells the story of how she forgave him ultimately. And those weren't unusual stories. In those kind of storytelling workshops that I've been at, then the next couple stood up and they told their story. So something remarkable has happened in Rwanda, and it's kind of I would call it an unheard story, and I'm really interested in untold stories. And so I ended up co-authoring with a young Rwandan screenwriter a love story which really is set in post-genocide Rwanda and tracks that whole long journey from hatred and the desire for revenge right through to reconciliation and forgiveness.
Is there something specific that you're aware of culturally that makes that more possible there amongst those people that differs from us, for example, in how we haven't been able to do that? What's laying the groundwork for it? What makes that possible?
I think there's a humility in African culture which we as Europeans don't have. We have more of a history of superiority in our culture, and African culture is different in that way. So there's a humility, which I think has made it possible. There's also uncomplicated simplicity about how they've approached reconciliation. So we make it overcomplicated. So we over-politicize it. We make it all about huge funding packages. Those who are coming from a faith perspective go round in theological circles. But in Rwanda, they just talk about love and forgiveness and living together at peace for the rest of their lives in villages where they don't have mains electricity, and it's a simple kind of rural subsistence farming lifestyle. And it's the difference is remarkable.
And not sullied by perverse incentives like government grants, aid.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about it in Rwanda is it is a government policy to reconciliation. There has been leadership on reconciliation. So you, as a citizen of Rwanda, you're expected to reconcile. That's part of your responsibility as a citizen. So, and Rwanda politically is, to some, it's not a Western democracy, but somehow, even though it's not a Western democracy, they've managed to create a kind of reconciliation which is actually genuine. It's not forced. Far beyond what we have managed to achieve in our democracy here.
So, in your view, it is robust and it will stick.
Yes, I mean it's rooted in the hearts of the people. That's what I've experienced there. There are those who are not reconciled, and they're still in prison. The genocidaires who believe what they did was right and they would want to do it again. So some of them are still in prison, and some of them are still being kind of hunted around the world to be brought to justice for their crimes. But the population, the young people, the next generation, and there is intergenerational trauma there in the way that we experience in terms of impact on mental health, etc. There's this shared commitment that we are one Rwanda now, and every year they have 100 days of remembering, and they say never again. They say that phrase, never again. And the young people who were born post-genocide, they come together on the day of remembering, and they light candles, and they have a very simple day of remembering, which again, we don't even have that after 25 years of peace, just to say we remember the people who lost their lives. And so that's kind of embedded in their life. That there's also a once a month, there's a kind of everyone as a citizen is required to do on a Saturday morning voluntary work to help build peace and build community. And that's seen as your responsibility as a Rwandan citizen. Okay. There's also all sorts of things that they've done, but it has been led politically in a way that we don't have leadership, political leadership around reconciliation.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'm going to park that for now, but we will return, and we'll return also to you in the context of your lived experience of here and what that brings. Michelle, can I shift to you now? And first of all, can I ask you to, from your own writing, if you don't mind, to contextualise your experience as someone who grew up on the border between Tyrone and Donegal. Have you got a little snippet that you want to share with us?
Sure, I can read a bit from Big Girl, Small Town, where the heroine is, she's sort of reflecting on the local area. So Big Girl, Small Town is a week in the life of Majella O'Neill, whose granny was beaten to death last week in the book, and her dad's disappeared, and her uncle's been blown up. And Majella, broadly speaking, has no interest in any of this. She would just like some chips and a good ride, if anyone was willing. So she's just had to drop her. She's just had to drop her mum off, or yeah, she just had to drop some tablets into her mum, and she's on a wee walk down to work. I like that. So 3:55 p.m. Item 14.4, medical stuff, incurable diseases. That's Magella's list of stuff she doesn't like. Magella dropped the tramadol into her mama and was now passing the chapel on her way back downtown towards Assault and Battered. As usual, she kept an eye on her pace, trying to make sure she walked just fast enough or slow enough to avoid conversation. Tuesday was market day, which meant that Magella ran the risk into bumping into Agnes Ferguson. In what Magella thought of as the olden times, farmers from all over Donegal, Fermanagh and Leitrim had gathered in Achibogie every first Tuesday to barter and spit over the top of cattle, boys, fruit and vegetables. This tradition was disrupted in the early 70s when the Brits undertook an operation to secure the area without discussing their plans with anyone on either side of the border. First, the army blew up 19 of the 20 country roads and every single bridge that crisscrossed the border between Achibogie and Donegal. They then dug a bunker and built a heavily fortified checkpoint on the last open road. It was manned by partially bulletproof soldiers who checked cars at gunpoint about 50 metres away from the tin shack that served as the official Irish customs checkpoint. Anyone who wanted to cross the border had to run the gauntlet of not one, but 2 international checkpoints within the space of 50 metres. Magella could remember spending hours held up at the Brit checkpoint, her dad out of the car, being searched and challenged, while the guards on the Irish side played cards in their tin shack, or occasionally wandered about outside with a nice cup of tea. For a few months after the road closures, the market had struggled on. But in the end, nobody had the patience to spend hours at an army checkpoint to get a trailer of scabby spuds or carrots to Achibogie. So the market withered and died, while local people started a new tradition of filling in the cratered roads and digging shallow beds in the river so tractors and jeeps could cross. And the Brits in turn cratered the repaired roads and dug out the river crossings under armed guard. And so it continued until the ceasefire, when a few roads were officially reopened. Now that was when Agnes Ferguson, who everyone knew was flaky because she'd left the town in a huff following the April Fool's Day bomb that had flattened her house but left the RUC station still standing. That's when Agnes returned to Achibogie. And Agnes told everyone she spoke to that she was back to build bridges. Now, Marty had explained to Magella that the bridges were not literal bridges. Agnes wanted to build bridges across community divisions. And this struck Magella as a much more difficult engineering project. One complicated by the fact that although most people could see the need for rebuilding the literal bridges, nobody in Nye for invisible bridges. And Magella herself did wonder why nobody had considered drawbridges in the whole scheme of things, which could serve as a bridge when the need arose. But she suspected that was a rare thought, and so she didn't share it with anyone, unlike Agnes, who seemed to have no hold on her thoughts. And the first time Magella saw Agnes, she was struck by the woman's deep suntan, the silver rings on her fingers, toes, nose, and ears. She listened to her funny accent and snuck glances at the 3 caramel-coloured children that Agnes had brought home without a man. During their first months in Achibogie, Agnes's children cut their long hair, lost their European accents, donned Nike trainers and Levi jeans, and started smoking players. Magella watched as their lovely skin faded to grey in the watery winter light.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. A real skirmish there, and an exploration through your characters and your novel and the stories of borders as limits, as boundaries, as things in our hearts, to go back to what Tony was saying, and as places to venture out from. Talk to me very briefly about your experience as a writer, as a woman, as someone who grew up on the border, and about the significance of story in the deep processing or the metabolizing of that as a lived experience.
I think I always, because I grew up in like a really rural area, and my grandmother kept in her wee cottage, she just basically, when people come in, she put the TV or the radio off, and we just started talking or yarning, as you say. And like the stories I heard growing up were stories of how my family were smugglers, which they were because they were right on the border. It was a great place for smuggling stuff, and how you could, if you were flat chested, you bought a big bra and you filled it up with sugar and you brought it backwards or forwards, but butter is a bad idea in a bra on a hot day. How you can distract guards by pretending to pee whenever they're going to arrest you. There's all these tricks. Anyway, they were basically priming us for who we were and what we could get up to. Poaching was another one they used to talk about. But the border was always the point of my family's stories, I guess, because my grandmother was born, pre-partition, and she could, she remembers when the border came into play, and then she remembered when the Troubles started, because that was before my time. And my father was part of civil resistance, part of the teams of men who did go out after the roads had been cratered, after kind of everything had been disrupted. So we had a really strong family history of what we did and who we were being formed by the border. And I think it was quite astonishing then when I remember leaving Northern Ireland and going down to Trinity College Dublin and kind of realizing that for most people down south there was like this border and nothing, or that they hadn't crossed it, they didn't know what was on the other side, they'd seen stuff on TV, but actually that was kind of boring or terrible or just not something they wanted to engage with. And I always remember this great feeling of crossing the border to go down south, this feeling of freedom, just even from the basics of not having a helicopter over your head. And then the opposite of, leaving the south and coming up north and going, here is home and here's where I belong and here are the clouds and the mountains and the atmosphere that I know I belong to.
In the folk memory of your family, was it a case, was it discussed that it was the Irish government had actually put the border in place, or had that been lost and transformed in the folk memory to the responsibility was with the British for having put that in place, because hence it becoming muddled in this other story of creators on the roads? And
I think now my memory of it is that the border was a financial opportunity for people living on it. You still had shops, you still had farms, people's life, broadly speaking, went on as before. There was a sense of abandonment, that we'd been left behind and that we were rural. But it was a two-currency economy, all that flow of culture, of people, of language, of cattle, of butter and bras, all of that was happening quite happily. So I think when it became a hard border was suddenly where it became a difficult, dangerous place. When you had a farm where overnight the British would dig a trench across your gate or across your drive so you can't cross your own drive to get to where you want to go, suddenly it became really competitive. And when you blow up, in our area, I think it was 24 roads that got blown up. And a journey that should take you 5 minutes was suddenly taking 40. All of that stuff then meant that your locus of hatred or, dislike or your feeling of aggression is going to be pointed at the people with the uniforms and guns and the explosives, rather than those people who kind of did something ages ago that we made the most of. There is nothing to be making the most of when you've blown the roads up and your shop is closed down and your car is confiscated and you can't move.
So the sense of abandonment was relegated?
Towards aggression for the people who were now disrupting this new way of life, where we had made a living and we had figured out a way to be on this border that wasn't entirely terrible. There was a way to make something of having that border. Now we were told, no, this is your side, stay on your side. It was no longer, I guess, porous.
Yeah. and the opportunity, the playful bit of gaming it,
Yeah, we were
was
those,
disrupted.
yeah, that kind of, you know, this sense of yourself going, well, we don't have a big university education, we're not doctors or lawyers, but we're fly. We know how to gamify what's going on around us so that we have food on the table and we have crack. And you paint a picture of yourself as wily and, you know, clever and smarter than both sides nearly. And then suddenly that's taken away from you.
Uh-huh. I think also, is it a case that, you know, in terms of primary and secondary education, there were opportunities that were different, that were open to you because you were by accident of birth born on this side of the border?
I've never understood that actually. I know my parents were that Catholic generation that got to go to college and became teachers, and that meant something huge to them. I know that I was able to go to Trinity College in Dublin because we could apply anywhere, but it wasn't this. I'm trying to think. It was that time before. I know when I got into Trinity and my brother tried to get in a few years later, he couldn't get in because the points had gone so crazy high, and it was, I forget what the change was. I'm trying to think of it. But I know from my parents' generation, this idea that they got their education in Northern Ireland and then got to college, became teachers, professionalized, was huge for them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what would have been open to them across the border.
Okay. So I suppose where I'm going with that question is that there was a generational shift in terms of, certainly for people here in the North at a particular point in time who could capitalise on the changes in the Education Act of 1945 that made it possible for more people to remain at school and gain an education and professional qualifications, and therefore begin to access that in a way. I mean, I suppose where, if I'm honest, where I'm coming from is that was a game changer for me, coming from a working class background, to be able to get access to an education, particularly when there were no other options. You know, you went on in school because what were you going to leave for? Nothing.
I think some people were forced to leave though. So I think even in my father's family, like there was the one that was going to be the priest, and then my father had to be a scholar. I know that they shifted one daughter off to England really quickly to earn money. You know, like why would you stay in education, go and earn money because you have a priest and a scholar to put through here? You know, like I know I had an uncle who didn't get to go into university by dint of the fact that troubles had broken out and he went a different direction. And, you know, opportunities available in Northern Ireland were weird and wonderful, right? You could come from a smuggling family and make poteen like my grandfather's or my grandmother's side, and then produce a priest and a scholar and a variety of other, you know.
Which was very good cover.
But yeah, but
Criminality, yeah.
but you know, there were other career options that you were being groomed for and were being offered to you in Northern Ireland. You know, it wasn't just this idea that if we educate you, you'll go into university. It's I feel, yeah, Northern Ireland was offering people various choices.
Okay. Michelle, we park that there for the time being and turn our attention to James. James, I know that while you're from Newry, you are also somebody who has spent considerable time in England. Can you talk to us from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so I suppose traditionally my family background would be that, you know, going kind of several generations back. On both sides of my family, my mom and dad's side, you know, we're kind of very firmly rooted in Newry and the South Armagh kind of area. But I suppose what complicates that, at least when, you know, partition happens and the 20th century happens, is that emigration becomes a big part of the story, whether that's through, you know, seeking out work opportunities, or whether it's, you know, going to another country to kind of, you know, find a route away from the kind of twin oppressions of church and state. and kind of, seek an opportunity to, kind of formulate your identity without, people kind of being on top of you all the time. So, while there is a firm rootedness in Newry, I always say to people that at various points through the 1950s and 1960s, all four of my grandparents spent time living and working in England and then came back at various points as well, just because of the opportunities that were available to them then, and the lack of opportunities that were available at home. That was kind of the understanding on the other side. And then my parents' generation, it was the same thing. So both of my parents in the 1980s emigrated to Coventry, where I ended up being born, because again, it was about trying to find kind of work and opportunity that wasn't available at home. My dad always likes to kind of quote to me that around the time that he went over to Coventry, about a year or two before I was born, Newry had the second highest unemployment in Western Europe. Number one, I think, was Strabane. Yeah. So, by dint of that alone, like, you can see that there was nothing for people here, really, unless you went to kind of the big urban centres of Belfast or Dublin, and latterly kind of Cork and Galway and places like that. So people had to go away, and that then becomes enmeshed within the kind of national fabric of Ireland. It can't help but be so, So when people have been away to England for a few years and they feel that they don't quite fit in on the other side of the water, suddenly they come back and they find that they don't fit in quite as comfortably as they did before when they come back here. So there's this kind of almost bordered mindset that gives birth to, where they're living between two places at once and never quite fitting into either.
And to what extent is that an opportunity then, because their own worldview is broadened by the fact they've left, even if they then subsequently come back? But what's the meaning of that act of moving, experiencing that dislocation, and what are the opportunities in that?
Well, I think the thing that kind of gives birth to is, it's this almost constant search for, like, utopianism, really. You go away from home thinking that the grass is going to be greener, literally, on the other side. And then you come back because of that same impulse. And you find that when you get to both places, that it wasn't what you thought it was going to be. So, that idea of not fitting in on both sides does give you a sense of kind of striving for something greater than either of the two experiences that you've had. And I suppose in that sense, maybe it's it gives you a sense of what's missing, a sense of, wanting all of the good things that go with groundedness and familiarity and community, on the one hand, but also the kind of openness and opportunity and, freedom, I suppose, that going away can grant you as well.
Yeah. I think the other aspect of that is, there are the diaspora, if you like, almost casts a disproportionate shadow to here, in a way. And I wonder to what extent then we are missing the opportunity to create the new here and now, because of the fact that we are also newly multicultural. We haven't come to any realization necessarily of what that means for us, but that's a change that has happened in the here and now, that is a new reality that isn't going to shift. How are we self-sabotaging within.
That's a good question. Yeah.
And what's our compulsion to do that?
I think the idea of self-sabotage is a really interesting one, particularly in the context of partition, because people talk about the border almost in abstract terms now. They talk about it because it's no longer this militarized thing with, you know, army watchtowers and helicopters policing it and all the rest, as almost like a benign, invisible part of the landscape, right? Actually, the most insidious aspect of the border and borders in general, to my mind, is the kind of long-termism, which is, you know, social conditioning. So when you've been long enough on one side of the border or the other, or indeed you've grown up in between the two, you know, in that liminal space of the border area itself, you know, you might think of yourself as as I have grown up in kind of a nationalist background and so on, thinking of yourself as Irish. But the reality of partition and the kind of day-to-day, you know, living of it, did create kind of social conditions which did mean that people in the border areas and people in the north were actively kind of differentiated from people in the south. And so I think in that sense, we've self-sabotaged because we have conditioned ourselves to be locked into these kind of very binary identities. You know, even when that kind of border was taken away, we still kind of almost keep it alive through the way that we communicate with each other, the kind of cultural differences that we propagate, and so on. And I think that's maybe the most insidious aspect of, you know, the long-term arrangement of the border.
Okay. James, I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to ask you just to suss out a small
Sure.
reading for us on the basis
Yeah.
that you are representing for me a market town on the border, and it's kind of semi-rural. And then Tony, yours is very much of here and of the city. So what I'm going to ask, first of all, while you get yourself ready, Tony, if you don't mind, if you would read an excerpt from your book to bring us back to those kind of borders within the cityscape, and then we'll hear from James, and just to give our audience a sense of we're soon coming to you for your questions.
So the very first time I went to one of those workshops, storytelling workshops in Rwanda, you know, we got out of the car on a dirt road, and we had to go through a banana plantation for about 30 minutes, and I ended up in this village with about 60 people in it, and I was the only white I was the wee fat Belfast man in the middle of this storytelling workshop with people from those villages, and they were really curious to ask me about why was I there and what was my interest, and they were surprised that this was a kind of a Western person that was coming, because I wanted to say, well, I also, you know, I come from a place that has experienced conflict and violence and the pain and suffering and that goes along with that. Not on the same scale, but I wanted to say, I come from something similar, and then they asked me all about here, and they were nodding their heads when some of the things I was saying. You know, there's an element of two tribes here and there, but when I told them about the peace walls, and the fact that the peace walls are still standing, they were totally horrified. And when I left them, they told me they would pray for us, that our walls would come down. So this goes right back to my youth when they were growing up. 1975, this is my 12-year-old self reflecting on the peace walls in Belfast in Paperboy. Of course, there were even bigger walls in the city than those between my customers. In fact, we were brilliant at walls in Belfast. They were going up everywhere, higher and higher all around me. For every inch that I grew, the walls surrounding me got 6 foot higher. Ever since the start of the Troubles, they'd been putting up walls between Protestant and Catholic streets to stop us killing each other. Of course, it didn't work, because ever since they built them, we'd been slaughtering each other even more. Most people on both sides, however, thought that the walls between us were a good idea, and it wasn't very often Catholics and Protestants agreed on anything. I suppose the walls made me feel safer because they helped me believe that it would be harder for the other side to get at me. When the walls were put up, you couldn't see the other side anymore, and they couldn't see you, and that was better for everybody. And if you wanted to show the other side how much you hated them, well, at least you had an obvious place to go to throw stones and bricks over at them. You didn't have to look at exactly what damage you had done to the other side, but at least you could be pretty sure you'd hurt them. Everyone called them peace walls, which I thought was funny, but not funny ha-ha. It was very strange, I thought, to call these walls peace walls because there hadn't been any of them before the Troubles when we had peace. The parts of Belfast that had the most peace walls, that had the most peace, didn't have peace walls. And the places in the city with the biggest peace walls were the streets where Catholics and Protestants had lived together previously before they started burning each other out, like the Springfield Road, where my father grew up and where my granny had got out just in time. Everywhere else in the world that had peace didn't have peace walls. However, in history class, I learned about another big wall in another city, the Berlin Wall, which separated the goodies in West Germany from the baddies in East Germany, although my granny continued to insist that all Germans were still baddies. The Berlin Wall was, as far as I could tell, a huge curtain made of iron, and apparently it was going to be there forever. Not like our peace walls, which were only going to be here until the Troubles were over. I wanted the Troubles to be over tomorrow because they were all I could ever remember. I hated all the fighting and killing more than I hated any Catholics or even the IRA. I thought it probably didn't matter when you got killed whether the ground around your coffin was Irish or British muck. Everyone said you could never trust the other side. Apparently, there were actually some good ones, but generally speaking, you couldn't trust them. Catholics were all supposed to support the IRA and wanted to kill us for United Ireland. So we had to defend ourselves to stay British because that was the most important thing in the world. I was never quite so sure about all of this. I knew that all Catholics on the other side of the peace wall had too many children and dead Irish dancing. But I couldn't accept they all wanted me dead. I was curious as to what they were really like over there. I had so many questions. Did they learn at their church too that we were all going to hell? Did they want to put us all on the Lawrence-Stranraer ferry back to Scotland? Did they really believe we were all rich? Were their paramilitaries full of wee hard men that liked to boss everyone around like ours were? I was curious about everyday life on the other side of the wall too. I wonder if they had paper boys over there as well, and if so, did the provost allow them to deliver the Ulsters on a Saturday night? Maybe there were wee lads over there too, with bad hearts and braces, who were worried that Sinead O'Burgess was falling in love with their big brother, who was brilliant at Gaelic football. Maybe the same mothers that we could hear banging their bin lids every August on the anniversary of interment also sewed dresses for posh ladies and ordered toys for Christmas from the Great Universal Club Book, even though it was posted from England. My father questioned divisions between working class people just as much as he questioned the existence of God. He hated the peace walls as much as I hated the fences between my customers. They had knocked down Lanark Street, where his family came from, and put up a peace wall instead. My dad was definitely in the minority on the Shankill when he said, "All I ever hear you saying is we need more walls put up to keep the other side out." Did you never think that it might be our side that's being walled in? He asked.
James.
That's great. No, it's hard to follow that. So I think one of the things I've been thinking about during our conversation is the ways in which borders kind of manifest themselves. You know, I kind of talked about social conditioning and hard borders and so on. And language, it always seems to me, is one of the the first things that kind of gets weaponized when people talk about borders, and you know, no clearer is that than here. You know, when we talk about the Irish language or Ulster Scots or even English, and then when you kind of look into it a little bit more, you discover that it's all kind of one big soup anyway. So this poem is a kind of reflection on that. It's about the origin of the name of Newry and where that came from. So it originally came from the Irish Ur Contra, which means the yew tree at the head of the strand. And the story behind that is that Newry was established when St. Patrick, sometime in the 5th century, planted a yew tree on the spot where he would later build a monastery. So this is just called Yew. At which point the saint lifted a fallen arrel and placed it in his alb, carrying it for miles until he reached the head of a desolate valley strand, whereupon, seeing only growths of sweetbriar in the mottled sand, he removed the thing and placed it in a small hole, invoking, though only the smallest of seeds yet growing shall become the tallest of all things, a tree, during which time the arrel split and a yew burst slowly into life, ruffling the sweetbriar and Patrick's stole, pointing its way toward heaven and crying, my God, this is where I'm rooted. So another aspect really of Banda Country, which is the collection that poem comes from, is the phrase Banda Country itself, and the kind of irony that's inherent in that. So the name Banda Country was kind of foisted upon Newry and the surrounding South Armagh area in the 1970s, allegedly by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Merlin Rees, in 1974. And what that gave birth to was a kind of sense of local stigmatization. You know, again, another example of that kind of weaponization of language. So the intention of calling the book Banda Country and then including stories that, you know, weren't that kind of salacious, blood and guts kind of narrative that was propagated in order to justify a certain level of kind of poverty and repression there. It was about kind of, I guess, you know, bucking the trend a little bit. But one of the things that I wanted to reclaim was the individuality of Newry, and you know how it was, how it is for me anyway, defined by local stories, folklore, urban legends, bits of gossip. You know, the things that are typical of small towns. And this next poem is one of those. It comes from a story that was told to me about by my granda. About a quarry that he used to swim in when he was a child in the 1940s and 1950s. And that was eventually kind of regarded as so dangerous by the adults that they put about a rumour among the kids that the quarry was bottomless, and in the hope that they would eventually stop swimming there. This imagines what that would be like if that was actually the case, if it was bottomless. It's called The Drowning. The story then became like this. He jumped in off a Clydesdale horse, then vanished like Eurydice beneath the sawdust, oil and gorse. His friends went looking for him there, sun-scorched in their wool net pants, beneath the rusted excavator, up from High Street and the manse. They brought corned beef and bits of soda, wrapped up in a greaseproof square. They took some chocolate from the soldiers, Darcy's kept in earthenware, and checked the crushers filled with ashlar, the Morris tipper and the track, decided they would jump in also when they failed to bring him back. And so the parents brought their hammers, bits of sheathing, casing nails, and built a mast from railway sleepers, darning suntans for their sails, and built a boat to cross the quarry, diving where their kids went in, and followed them into the hollow, which locals said had no bottom. And so the mayor dived for the parents, worried for his yearly vote, and so the council braved the currents for their leader's anecdote. And then the doctors and the soldiers, followed by the entire town, until at last they filled the swim hole and all of us were underground.
James. I want to turn and bring in our audience now into the discussion. I'm really struck by the through line, if you like, of the role of stories, narrative, language. We're writers. How then are we part of generating a change in the narrative, deepening the expression and developing beyond, if you like, the grooves that we habitually fall into. So, you know, kind of those are the things that are around for me. Have we questions from the audience? Struck dumb. All good. Tony.
Just what you just said, Maria. I believe the power of stories. One of the things about the power of stories, you can't really argue with someone's story. You can argue about politics and religion forever, but you can't really argue with someone's story. And when you listen genuinely to someone's story, you're likely to discover the humanity in that person. And I think the more stories we hear, the closer we get to the truth of a place. You know, the bigger the web of stories that we have, the closer we get to really understand who we are.
Who are we deaf to that we ought to be listening to? Michelle?
The 1 in 5 people who live on the island of Ireland who were not born here. 1 in 5. The 1 in 4 people in the Republic of Ireland, in fairness, workforce who were not born here. I mean, my kids were born in London. My husband's French Moroccan. I met him in Derry. My kids are entitled to 4 different passports, and they're trying to integrate into Dublin, which had its race riots, 2 weeks ago. I feel we're not even listening to a certain class of native white Irish person in many ways, and we aren't looking at all the way there are conflicting narratives in the world, on the internet in particular, and what the accepted narratives are going out in the radio and television, what's going into books. There's an awful lot of not listening being done, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. What are the opportunities, James?
Just to echo what Michelle just said there, yeah, you know, it's the demonization of migrants coming in, but also the demonization of the working class as the kind of, you know, main purveyors of this racist ideology, which has been deliberately, in my view, fostered by people who have a stake in those divisions existing in the first place. So if there's an opportunity inherent in that, I think it's recognizing who those people are who are deliberately profiting off those divisions and removing them from power.
So I'm working on a project at the minute. Working title is Nigerians in the North. Mm-hmm. And you know one of my friends who's involved in this, and I had such a positive sort of cross-cultural collaboration on Kill the Devil with a Rwandan author that I was interested in doing something similar, and I met a Nigerian theatre writer who is living in Northern Ireland now, and as part of that process, it's about the stories of Nigerians here. And actually, just last week we had a Zoom call with a range of Nigerians living in Northern Ireland, and he was asking them questions about their story. And there's a kind of a surface story, and then as we went on and he asked more questions and the trust built up, we really got to hear a deeper story about the real experience for newcomers who come to live here, which they won't politely tell us in polite conversation. And when you start to get the real sense of how challenging it is to come here as a newcomer. So I think that I think letting those stories come through in art, I think, is really important.
Okay, so we have a responsibility, because that was going to be my next and final question, is what is our responsibility in this? And part of it is shutting up. And the other part is amplifying those voices, right? In some way. Have you anything to add to that? Any final thoughts? James, if we go final thoughts, and Michelle and Tony, and we'll wrap it up at that.
Yeah, I think, again, to echo what Tony was saying, you know, things looked pretty bleak a couple of weeks ago when people took to the streets and were chanting, you know, and being quite inhospitable, if I can use a euphemism. I think during times like that, when things seem like they're at their most negative, is actually the point at which things become clearer and more identifiable, and that's the point at which there is an actual real opportunity to go, right, this is a line, and now is the time to kind of, for us, as you said, to shut up and amplify the voices that aren't being heard. So I think if we're going to end on a positive note, I think that that's what we will begin to see next. I'm hopeful of that.
Michelle?
We have to end on a positive note.
Not necessarily. I'm thinking change happens anyway, okay? But if you were to project 50 years into the future, and as a mother of children who are triracial and growing up in this context, all of those, amazing changes and difference here. You're right at the very leading edge, not only in your own lived experience, but with your children. Project a vision for this country 50 years hence.
I think we really need to talk about, this is tough, right? You're talking about a planet that's undergoing climate change. You're talking about a country that even before Brexit had 60 million Irish passports in the world live, being used, not passports that were not being used, but being used. You have anyone with an Irish grandparent been able to claim Irish passport, whether that means, I don't know what that means. You have a country that's really struggling to integrate, I would say, I'm going to be honest, Northern nationalists are not being integrated the way you might imagine. It would be easy to integrate us, let alone Northern Unionists, let alone people who come from a very different background. I would love to say 50 years in the future, we've got it sorted. And in one way, I look at my kids' schools, and both my kids started in an Educate Together school, which is, it's all religions. It's not no religion, it's all religions. And these are one of the main reasons we decided to live down south rather than up north, was that non-religious education. But still in Ireland, I would like to think they'll have solved some of the structural inequality they have. Like, I live in inner city Dublin 8, and there are no secondary schools for our kids that aren't either single sex or single religion, because Dublin 8 is viewed as this kind of inner city poor area, much like where they were rioting in Dublin 1 and stuff. I think I would love to see in Ireland where we've had the difficult conversations about how many people might want to live here, what those people might want from this country, what we can give those people, and what we can make of all the resources we have, cultural, like physical, emotional. But I still think 50 years feels like not enough time to do the work when you think about how long ago we had the ceasefire and we don't have a single day of remembrance.
So, finally,
So my
are we up for it?
on a hopeful note,
Hopeful.
traditionally we have looked west for expertise of the way to do things. You know, we used to have lots of Americans come to tell us how to have peace. I think there's hope if we look east, if we reverse that. And a lot of the new people who are coming to live here are coming from the east to here. But I think if we look at a model like Rwanda in terms of what's actually possible, I think there's hope. And if we can learn, if we have the humility to learn from places like Rwanda, that does give me hope, because if they can do it there, there's no reason why we can't do it here as well. And I think stories and storytelling is such a powerful part of it.
Chap at the back.
Oh, you're talking to this?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask the panel, is there anything positive that came out of the Troubles? Was there people made good out of it? Like your good selves up there, like, you know, you got your background and your talk and all from the Troubles. If you hadn't had the Troubles, would you be sitting up there tonight? Would you be doing a wee job like me somewhere? Did the Troubles contribute to your success? Each one of you. Well,
I would say growing up during the Troubles has shaped my life, yeah.
yeah. Tony.
Well, I think to come from a country that has experienced conflict and to come from the sort of background that I come from, there is something in that is good, and especially when you go to other countries that you go in with humility and you go in grounded.
Good.
Not yeah.
Sorry, is your name Michelle?
Michelle.
Oh, Michelle.
I only sound like Magellan when I read it. You know, I had a brain injury when I was 23, left me in a wheelchair, and I couldn't remember my second name. And I used to say to people, I'm so lucky because, you know, give me this perspective on life and I'm a better person for it. But to be honest, if I could do the delete button on a brain injury or the Troubles, I would. I think I'm a different person. I think that I've written things that I wouldn't have written if I grew up 2 miles over the border even. I do not think that I'm a richer person for it. I don't think I'm healthier, and I think people are dead who shouldn't be dead.
Well, you're going to get that anyhow, no matter where you go. There's more people killed in Glasgow in the same period of time and the 3,000 killed here in that period. My good friend from the same saw that I come from.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would frame it as good. What I would say is it is what it is. You know, I wouldn't be who I am, Michelle wouldn't be who she is, and Tony wouldn't be who he is had that not happened. It's just an accident of kind of circumstances and experience. What I will say is that that is kind of there are individual circumstances within societal circumstances that allow people to get to where they are in life. I don't think that conflict generally can be viewed as a positive thing at all. You know, if I was to look at, you know, what's happening in Palestine at the moment as an example, I can't see that being anything other than completely horrifying for generations to come. And that the art that may or may not come out of that, I can't anticipate that being anything other than a profound expression of pain. And so from that sense, I wouldn't kind of wish that on anybody. But I do think that just being who we are and coming from the life circumstances that we have, all we can try to do is fashion something out of it. It would be nicer if the material that we had to fashion out of was nicer and more coherent and less painful. But you kind of you play the hand you're kind of dealt, I think. But yeah, I think what we have here and the expression of art that we have here happened in spite of, not because of, the Troubles.
Did you want to say something, Michelle? Did you want to add to that?
Well, I suppose, and it sounds glib, but you know, I'd rather be writing about going to Trinity and feeling sad and having sex and selling millions of those books than doing the hard sell in Northern Irish stuff, because it is a hard sell. I know that there's a brilliant way of writing. I know our art is amazing, but it is not considered, you know, the sort of chocolate mousse of the bookshelf. It is tough going sometimes to get through this kind of stuff. So yeah, maybe there's an alternative universe where we're all just like really chilled out and nothing bad ever happened to us, and we're just writing, I don't know, episodes of Friends or something. Yeah.
Just a short comment, kind of like a point of information. We do have a day of reflection on the summer solstice on the 21st of June. You know, it's kind of led by Healing Through Remembering. And I've been here long enough, and I'm still, maybe we haven't reached a point of identifying a need to reflect, but I'm still intrigued about how it hasn't been taken up by ourselves, by this society. And I'm just wondering if there's any reflection or comments about why is that, or maybe what would it take for us to feel a compulsion to actually acknowledge that we should reflect at least one day a year.
I think it's about leadership. We haven't had political, that's not seen as a vote winner here, but it needs leadership. It is very clear leadership in Rwanda. Yeah, as I said earlier, you're expected as a citizen to be part of that. We don't have that kind of leadership. But I think if any of those kind of parts of the reconciliation jigsaw might come into place here, it is the least contentious one. So I think I'm hopeful that work that's been done of day of reflection will one day become an official day of reflection, and our children and our grandchildren will participate in that every year, and they'll remember and they'll say never again.
Is that us? Any other question on the floor? Yes, Anna.
You use the expression genocidal ideology, which is like really powerful. And when you were speaking with the Rwandan people, did they actually use that themselves, and did they speak about becoming aware of that's what it was, and you know the extent of that and how long?
Yeah, there's a lot of, in the whole education system in Rwanda, they're educated about how that began and the language that was used and the media that was used, and the Genocide Memorial Museum in Kigali actually takes you through that whole process of how it developed and how it was planned, and then even when it was happening, it was denied that it was happening, and so they learn about that in school in Rwanda, so that it never happens again. Mm-hmm.
Yes. One very final question. Thank you.
Thanks. You talked this evening about like the race riots in Dublin a couple of weeks ago and sort of problems like that, and also I thought a bit about the sort of areas of Belfast still with peace walls, and I was wondering with your own work how you see yourselves, or do you see yourselves as able to reach like say young disillusioned working class people who are very unlikely to come to events like this, but using your own work as a tool for peace building, have you been able to reach those groups, or do you see ways in which you could reach them? Or, to me that seems like an important part of the jigsaw. But yeah, if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, that's a wee bit of my background. I've been doing that, but I've been involved in youth work and that kind of thing for many years, and so I think that's really important. I think it's important for it to be their voices. I remember working with a group of young people just like that a few years ago in North Belfast, and they started out, and I suggested some ideas, and there was a community kind of director worked with them, and they created their own thing in the end. They didn't include anything that I suggested, and it was really good. And there was one amazing point that I'll always remember in that, and they all stood up on stage, and all their parents were there to see the performance. and they all stood up on stage and they addressed the audience and said, what was the line? Something like, why is it we still have to deal with all your crap? And I just thought it was really powerful, because I wouldn't have written it like that. And it really challenged my generation sitting in the audience listening to that, because they remember saying that about their parents as well.
I feel that I'm not going to speak for working class people in the north or in Dublin or anything, but I mean, I am the sickening person who's trying to have difficult conversations with everybody I meet. And I am the sickening person who's saying, you know, you're welcoming my husband when you think he's French, but when you've realized he's French Moroccan, suddenly your conversation changes. I experienced racism applying for secondary school in Dublin this past few months. So I feel I'm the person who is, well, I've written a third book about basically what it's like to move to Ireland with, you know, mixed race kids and a mixed race husband. And my US editor is saying to me, why haven't I delivered it? And I'm like, because I don't want somebody to put dog shit through my letterbox or a petrol bomb through my window. So I don't come from a fancy background, but I've got this kind of safe lifestyle in Dublin that I want to protect. But I will say it's absolutely exhausting, whether you have tons of money or no money, it's absolutely exhausting to have these conversations. And I think we should all be having them. I think we should be having the direct, difficult conversations that we consider impolite right now. And getting it out in the open, I think, is the first step to actually solving the problems, is admitting there's a problem.
Yeah, I think to kind of take a little bit of what Tony and Michelle were saying, that on the one hand, it isn't really about our work and whether our work translates to an audience like that. It's about using the kind of tools that we have developed during the writing process and trying to give those tools to other people so that they can express themselves safely, confidently, truthfully, in a forum where in the initial stages, because you have to remember that, you know, we all come from different educational backgrounds and so on, in a space where they can kind of feel safe that they're being heard. I think that's important. I think all we three can do, and anyone kind of in the arts can do, is to hand off those tools of self-expression that we have developed for ourselves and see where that takes us. But beyond that, art and the measurement of the power that it has as a kind of consumable product, it's hard to measure. You can only really kind of take it on a reader by reader basis and what different people get from it.
Great. I'm going to bring our discussion to a close and thank our panel for their input. The big takeaway for me is that we have many new borders and boundaries here now, because we are also newly multicultural. We are in new realities as we evolve further. The opportunities and the responsibilities within that are there for all of us to become a part of a new narrative, and we have to engage with that and not really allow racism to become the new sectarianism, and not just settle for that. Thank you. Cheers.